Welcome to this session, which is part of a module related to training, but also a session which has very broad consequences for pretty much every area within the field of exercise physiology and indeed exercise science. And that is the notion of fatigue, and in this case, the idea of the peripheral mechanisms of fatigue. So within this session, what we're going to address are the following. We're going to critically evaluate the concept of fatigue, and we're going to do this both as a central and peripheral mechanism, and that's fundamental to allow us to establish what we mean by peripheral fatigue and then give us the rationale and almost the kind of the permission to go and focus and study that for the rest of this session. Then we'll get into discussing the potential factors which contribute to peripheral fatigue, and from the outset be absolutely clear, within an hour session we don't have capacity, time, capability to really address all of them. It's an area that really could be studied, as a course in itself. So we're going to pick on some of the bigger options and the bigger factors that we know are associated with peripheral fatigue, particularly in clinical and also in athletic population groups. And then we will start the debate. This will kind of be floating around as we go through this whole session about what causes and contributes to central fatigue. Because again, if we're separating the two out and we're going to focus on peripheral, it's probably only fair that we give a little bit of a thought to what actually is central fatigue and what potentially may contribute to it. So let's start here, which is that notion of the factors which potentially contribute to fatigue. And there's quite a distinction to be made here. So if we look at this category that we've got here in terms of peripheral factors or peripheral mechanisms, then one can start to see that they clearly have quite a physiological construct to them. Neuromuscular transmission, excitation, contraction, coupling or recoupling, substrate availability, so things like changes in phosphocreatine stores or muscle glycogen content, changes in metabolites, things like hydrogen ion concentration or changes in ammonia, electrolyte gradients, and even changes in sympathetic nervous function. Whereas we look at the list which relates to central, then one can argue, yes, they have a physiological construct in some areas like endocrine abnormalities, so for example changes in things like aldosterone or dopamine or serotonin, for example. But they certainly feel less exercise physiology as we see in peripheral. Feedback from muscle, motivation, discomfort, sleep disorders, central nervous system motor drive. And in many ways, these lists, although not extensive and not conclusive in terms of all the factors that are there, allow us to really establish a difference between these two areas. That peripheral is anything beyond the neuromuscular junction. So from the neuromuscular junction going into the cell. So anything beyond that point. Anything prior to the neuromuscular junction, which is in essence the central nervous system, is considered to be centrally orientated fatigue. And that's why we get this distinction that you can see here, that these parameters really are very much associated with central nervous system, and these are very much associated with muscle-based function. So with those in mind, it's perhaps worth getting us a definition or having a definition that we can agree on, from which we can move forward in relation to peripheral fatigue. And we're going to use two kind of definitions to help us perhaps bridge the gap and form a consensus statement. So the first is from Edwards back in 1981. It's a long time ago, but it's still a very, very strong definition. They define peripheral fatigue as a failure to maintain the required expected force, leading to reduced performance of a given task. Now, that's not an insubstantial definition in its own right, but if we compare that to this one, also from 1981, from Thomas and colleagues, and they say, well, it's a condition of intramuscular failure, and it's been defined where there is a failure at a point beyond the neuromuscular junction. Well, If we combine the two, we've probably got the universal definition. On their own, they kind of miss some of the key points. If you look at the Thomas one, it doesn't really refer to kind of the task, and if we look at the Edwards one, it doesn't really refer to the locale. So if we kind of look at this in a kind of more holistic approach and go, well, peripheral fatigue is a condition of intramuscular failure, and it's defined where there is a failure to point beyond the neuromuscular junction, and it's a failure to maintain the required expected force, leading to reduced performance of a given task. So by combining the two, we are getting a clearer definition on what we mean by peripheral fatigue. Now, you may be thinking, well, hold on, why is this so important if we are perhaps doing this and I'm watching this and learning this as part of a series in relation to training and athletic performance? Well, fundamentally, remember that fatigue drives biological adaptation. So without fatigue, and in this case we're dealing primarily with peripheral fatigue, we don't get the biological growth that we're looking for. So unless we develop fatigue beyond the neuromuscular junction, we don't get changes in for example, muscle hypertrophy. We don't get sarcomere adaptation. We don't get changes in substrate levels. We don't get increases in force generation. So fatigue becomes really important, but it's also got that negative connotation, which is that if we become fatigued, it reduces, in fact, as we've got here in our definitions, it reduces the performance for a given task. And if the fatigue is too much and we reduce the force too much, then actually the nature of the training session changes and it has that kind of negative connotation, that negative consequence. So understanding the relevancy of fatigue becomes incredibly important to us within the field of exercise science, both from an applied athletic perspective, but also in clinical populations and clinical studies. So where does central fatigue fit? Well, central fatigue, not surprisingly, is a failure within the central nervous system itself. So it's kind of anything up to the neuromuscular junction. So that is absolutely central nervous system. And anything beyond the neuromuscular junction is your peripheral fatigue. Nice and clear, I hope, in terms of that definition between the two.